My name is Monk Rowe. We're filming for the Hamilton College Jazz Archive in New York City. I'm especially pleased that George Wein has found a little time for me today, and I'm most appreciative.
Anybody with a name by Monk can't be all bad.
I'll take whatever entrance I can get, believe me. I usually introduce someone as a saxophonist or whatever, and with you I'd have to spend 5 minutes, so everyone knows your reputation. I want to see if I can take you back a little bit. Music obviously must have been in you from the start. Can you recall as a child what music started to really make an impression on you, and where did you hear it?
I go back a long way, Monk. I was born in 1925, and I used to sing the pop songs when I was 6 and 7 years old. I go back to songs, my mother used to play a little piano, and I used to sing songs like I Want to Go Back to My Little Grass Shack in Kealakekua, Hawaii. And once in a while, on a Saturday morning, she'd take me down to these kiddie shows, where you auditioned and you'd sing. You didn't get paid. I mean, it wasn't a gig. But you'd sing over the radio, and that was such a thrill to sing over the radio when you're 6, 7, or 8 years old. And I learned all the popular songs, and Darkness on the Delta was one of my favorite tunes. And one night I was on tour with Thelonious Monk, and he played an encore. He liked to play solo piano encores, and he played Darkness on the Delta. I had never heard anybody play that tune, Darkness on the Delta, except when I sang it when I was a kid. And I said, Thelonious, where did you learn that tune? People don't realize that Thelonious came out of that era, and he knew all those songs. And it was a great thrill for me to hear Thelonious play in Darkness on the Delta.
Well, I suppose he gave it his own unique treatment, too.
It wasn't like I heard it in 1934 or whatever year it was.
Wow, that's neat. And you say the pop songs of the day, these are things that would be like on the radio with vocal groups and
the Tin Pan Alley songs of the 30s. All these, the Bob Hope had Thanks for the Memories, all those tunes, and I used to sing them all. Hold me, honey, won't you hold me, hold me. You don't know how many of those tunes. Nobody knows those tunes.
But you could go out and buy the sheet music, I suppose.
Well, my mother would buy the sheet music. And she could play it. She had to buy the one she could play because she wasn't a great piano player.
Right.
But at least she could read a little sheet music and accompany me.
Was your mother? If you said to your mother C7.
No. She didn't know that at all. Yeah. She didn't know anything about that.
But she could read the sheet music and so forth. Oh, that's great. So you kind of naturally, you had the piano in the house. Did anybody have to push you into it?
I studied classical piano when I was about 7 or 8 years old, and I played there classical for about 4 or 5 years. I studied with a very famous teacher, but she wasn't famous when I studied with her, Mrs. Charloff, and she later became Madame Charloff at the Berkeley College, and her son was Serge Charloff. Serge went to school with me. And she was a wonderful woman, and she really gave me a technique. She didn't teach me a lot about music, which was unfortunate, because that's one of the reasons I never knew more about music. But she taught me how to play the piano, which I still know how to play the piano, but I don't have a great grounding in harmonies and voicings, so. But I have a lot of fun playing.
Yeah. Was there a point where the classical lessons just wasn't enough?
They petered out, and I wanted to learn how to play popular, so I could. I don't know why I didn't think of myself as a singer, but I like to play and sing, and so I wanted to accompany myself instead of have my mother accompany, because I just sang at, at the parties in the house, Georgie, you got to sing a song, Georgie, you got to sing a song, And I don't want to give you the impression I was a good singer, but I was a kid that could sing a song. And I wasn't any boy wonder. But to my father and mother, I was the greatest. I wasn't the greatest to anybody else, but to my father and mother, I was the greatest, which is nice.
Yeah.
You grow up with a feeling of security and love. It's nice. And the next thing I knew, my brother brought home some records of Louis Armstrong and Glenn Gray and Jimmy Lunsford. He bought a little record player and got 13 free records with the record player. They were all jazz records. he was 4 years older than I was, and he used to go to the dances. Because, and this was, I guess it was 11 or 12 years, I don't know. And then I really became interested in jazz. And not jazz, but big band, you know, Tommy Dorsey, Benny Goodman. Next thing I know, I had formed a band. Like kids form rock and roll bands. I was in junior high school, and we used to rehearse every Sunday in my cellar at the house we had in Newton, Massachusetts. And I found 4 saxophones and 2 trombones and 3 trumpets and piano, bass. I was a piano player. I went up and bought stock arrangements. We all bought them. And my mother knew somebody from New York that I went down there. We took a trip. I got free arrangements from the publishers. And just like a kid has a rock and roll band nowadays, I had a dancer. We used to play Tommy Dorsey's Song of India and Glenn Miller's In the Mood and Erskine Hawkins' Tuxedo Junction. And we had a lot of fun. And we used to work an occasional. Somebody took pity and hired the kids for a gig, and we made $2 a night, you know. But then I got interested in small band music, and I started to learn. I studied with a great jazz teacher by the name of Sam Sachs, and he taught me about chords and taught me about how to play in different keys and things like that. And we'd take a standard. I have to play it in all 12 different keys, so I learned a lot from him. And next thing you know, my name got on the list of a non-union booker. While I was in high school, I was working gigs in what you call the buckets of blood, you know, the Ort's Grill and the Silver Dollar Bar for $2 a night, $3 a night, $5 a night. And while I was going to school, and I didn't work a lot, but I'd go in. I didn't know much, and I'd go in. I didn't know any musicians we were playing with, and none of us knew anything. But we did it, and we learned. And I became very involved with jazz music, and then I became friendly. Friends of mine knew Lionel Hampton. They knew Frankie Newton. They knew, you know, I met my brother knew Red Allen and J.C. Higginbotham, and I'd sit in with them, and it was a big thrill. Lionel Hampton I met when I was, I think, 16, and I was at a party, and he heard that I played a little piano, and I remember I sat down and played the bass while he did the 2-finger thing on Lady Be Good. I mean, what a thrill. I mean, Lionel Hampton was playing, and I'm playing Lady Be Good chords. And, you know, gets in your blood. And a couple of nights later, we went down to see Lionel at the TikTok Club. My mother and father with me, and my mother and father loved music. And Lionel calls me up from the audience, and I'm on the stage of the TikTok Cafe where Lionel, Illinois Jacquette was in the band, Dexter Gordon was in it. I didn't know who they were at that time. Joe Newman was in the band, and I'm playing Lionel on the stage, and people are applauding, and man, you're hung up the rest of your life when that happens. You know what I mean? That's it.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah. You know, I have to remind myself when you talk about some of those tunes you were playing with your first band, they sound old, but for you guys, that was the current music of the day. Is that right?
Oh yes, we were not playing old music. And old music was Bix Beiderbecke.
Okay.
We were playing Teddy Wilson and Benny Goodman. It was swing, you know, and that was the hip music of the day. It was before bebop. This was before the war, you know, and we were trying to be we were Duke Ellington, you know, and so but I was getting into it.
Did your parents like the direction you took?
They didn't know. I had no direction. I was a kid playing the piano. I mean, my folks would sometimes pick me up at 1 o'clock in the morning when I was playing some of these joints. And I mean, they were joints. I mean, I was playing joints. And they would be out in the car waiting for me to get. I was 16 or 17 years old before, even 15 years old. I don't know, you know, and I can't recall exactly, but there were a couple of years I'd go out. You can't believe some of those joints in Boston. You know, they were sailor joints. There were fights, and, you know, and they needed non-union musicians who could. I mean, I knew about 12 songs, you know, but I was trying to play the others by ear, and I didn't have a good ear. I was playing all wrong changes. But you were learning. It was a great period of learning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess you could hide behind the piano if things got too rough in there.
Sometimes you did.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it was the war had started, And there were a lot of sailors, and they would get drunk, and the SPs and the MPs would come in there. And I remember once they hit the guy over the head, and the blood spurted up to the ceiling. I mean, it was. But this wasn't the way I made my living. I was still a high school student
Yeah.
in a nice middle-class city of Newton, Massachusetts, you know.
Right.
But it was fun. And the next thing I know, I was in the Army. I graduated from high school. And I was 1940, this January 44, I went in the Army. And all during the Army, I was never in a musical group. But we always played music. Whatever group we were in, there were musicians. We'd form a band, and there were some good musicians there. And I really had a fun play. I was in the combat engineers. I wasn't in an easy group. We were lucky that we didn't see combat. But we were in Europe. We were waiting for we were rehearsing to build bridges to cross the Rhine. And then one day we woke up, there was what they call the Remagen bridgehead, which historically was the bridge that they captured and crossed the Rhine. The Germans didn't blow it up in time. And that saved us because we never had to go into combat. But we were in England waiting to be told to go there. An outfit we had trained with at the same camp in Oklahoma, Camp Gruber, was there, and they got shot up pretty badly. So playing the piano saved a lot of problems for me in the Army, you know, because we played the officers' dances, and if we get in trouble, the officer would say, "What's the matter, Wayne? You having a problem?" I says, "No, sir, I'm fine, but this company punishment is killing me," you know, because I'd be talking back to a sergeant or something like that. And next thing I know, I'd be off company punishment because they wanted us to be able to play the officers' dances. So playing the piano had its pluses.
Excellent.
You know, so.
Did you fellas get to listen to those V-discs that came over?
In England, I found them. I found them in the little, we had little huts, you know, where we could get tea, and there was some record players, and there were always some V-discs there. And I didn't know what they were because we couldn't buy those. And there was great stuff with Fats Waller and Louis, and a lot of them were not ever put out on records. Maybe some of them have been reissued up at this point. But and they weren't issued for years, you know. So, but I had a good time in the Army. I hated every minute I was in the Army. And when I got out, I mean, when they dropped the bomb, the atomic bomb, which has since become such a controversial thing, I remember I was in Marseille, and I sat down on a dirt road. It was a camp, you know, and started to cry with relief. I was going home. So when I hear all the controversy about the atomic bomb, I can never forget my feeling when we dropped that bomb and I knew we were going home. I wasn't going to be involved. I was supposed to take a boat and be involved in the invasion to Japan because we were on a staging area in Marseille waiting to go through the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal all the way to Japan. And I never left, and I went home, and so that was an interesting part of my life, you know.
I bet you weren't alone in that feeling, too.
Oh, I'm sure everybody did. But the thing I learned in the Army that was, hey, you were only yourself. You were not Dr. Wayne's son. You were not a nice Jewish kid from a middle-class family with economics background. Nothing meant anything except you yourself, and you had to compete with the other guy. Now, the other guy might have been a brilliant guy from Harvard. He might have been some poor guy from the mountains in Kentucky. He might have been a tough mug from the factories somewhere in Detroit. You had to be equal with them. You had nothing going for you except yourself, and you learned how to handle yourself. And that has been a benefit to me all of my life. And I'm very happy I went through that. I would never ask anybody to go through it again because Army life is not any fun. You know, I mean, it's terrible. But if you go through it, it's worth it.
A lot of the musicians I've talked to have been fortunate that they were musicians, much like yourself.
But I had an opportunity to go to Warrant Officers School. Which would have meant I would have had a really plush life in the Army. But somebody told me that we would go in what you call the Army Special Training Program and take basic training and then go to college for 4 years and then get a commission and go in the Army. Well, they wiped that program out, and we were all thrown into the infantry. And that was it. From the infantry, I went to the combat engineers. So I never had the benefit of being in a musical outfit.
Yeah.
But because we played, we always found guys that played. On every camp that we went to, there were guys that played. Even on the boat coming home, there was a group of musicians. All the trip home, which in those days took 8 or 9 days on the ocean, 10 days. It was, you know, they weren't fast ships. We'd play music all the time. So
Yeah.
it was always a saving grace for me, you know.
Excellent. I have a very short quote from the All Music Guide to Jazz, who describes you as an Earl Hines-influenced pianist. Would you,
Sam Sachs, my teacher, was a disciple of Earl Hines. And in those days, of course, you didn't have Bud Powell. Earl Hines was the piano player for the big bands. I loved Teddy Wilson and Earl Hines. Teddy Wilson was a refined version of Earl Hines. Earl Hines played with octaves and tremolos. Teddy played single finger. But they had the same basic approach to the music, the same melodic approach. And so I loved both of those players. And later on, I studied with Teddy Wilson when I was in college. In my junior year, I came to New York and studied with him at Juilliard. And I got to know him. But all during college, I was playing the piano. And then I got involved with a lot of jazz players in Boston. And then one time they had a band coming to the Ken Club in Boston with Pee Wee Russell and Max Kaminsky and Miff Mole, and they needed a Boston rhythm section. And the regular piano player that normally played those Dixieland and traditional tunes that they played wasn't available. And I knew him, and he taught me the tunes. The next thing I know, I was playing 7 nights and Sunday afternoon for 4 or 6 weeks while I was still going to college, because it was a 7-day program and a Sunday afternoon program, and I was still going to college. But I loved that. And at the same time that I loved that, Pee Wee Russell, I mean, I've been in love with Pee Wee Russell ever since. And I think that engagement was what determined that I was not going to make my life as a professional piano player. Because I saw the way that these world-famous musicians lived in cheap hotels, working. I was making $60 a week. They were making $120 a week. They were the stars. Now, $120 a week in 1948 was a week's pay, but it sure wasn't much money for somebody that was a world-famous star, whose people collected his records everywhere you went. And I think in seeing them drunk in their rooms at night, you know, and so lonely and so out of it, I said, I'm not sure that this is the life I really want, even though I love playing and I love the music. And I don't think I consciously made a decision at that time. I know I didn't consciously make a decision, because the next year I played with Edmund Hall and his quartet at the Savoy, and I was working gigs and I was having a ball. I was making money while I was in college. I arranged my senior year in college so I only have classes Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, so I could at least get to sleep 4 days a week, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You know, in the morning when I woke up. And because I was playing so much. And when I graduated college, I was playing a lot of gigs, playing in clubs. I was booking the bands at the Savoy Jazz Club in Boston and playing, getting a different band every week, because the woman that owned the place says, why not, since you're the piano player, why don't you bring the musicians up from New York, because we knew them. And I found myself organizing things. And then one day somebody says, well, why don't you open up your own club? I mean, I never had a direction or a motivation, you see. I said, I have no money to open up a club, you know. But I had $5,000 that had been saved for my education. My folks weren't rich. They had a little money, but they weren't rich people. Father was a doctor. He never saved much money. He went to the racetrack every afternoon. He did his work in the morning, made enough money to support the house, and lost the rest of it at the racetrack for 25 years. But saved his life. He lived to be 96 years old, so he always said all his friends were dead. They worked too hard. He was still alive. And I had this money because I went to college on the GI Bill. And I made a deal with a hotel and opened up Storyville in the fall of 1950. and I was been in business ever since.
It's like you were improvising from the moment, every time a moment came up.
I had never been in business.
Yeah.
I didn't know what it was to be in business. I wasn't a businessman. I mean, I graduated, I was playing piano, and somebody says, open up a club. I opened up a club, but I knew everybody in Boston. I knew the whole jazz world. I knew all the radio people. I knew, because I'd been playing at clubs all the time. And I'd done one concert with Edmund Hall. It was Edmund Hall and George Wein present, and Nat Hentoff wrote the liner notes because he was Boston DJ at that time and a good friend of mine. And we brought up Wild Bill Davison and a few other guests. We sold out Jordan Hall. And the first promotion I ever did, we sold out 1,000 tickets. Well, man, you know, who knows? You know, where are you? I mean, you're a star, right? You sold out a concert. Boy.
Well, as clubs go, you had a great run. I mean, when you think about how quickly some clubs open and close.
Well, we made it for 10 years.
Yeah.
We never made any money, couldn't make any money, but we did have good weeks. The bad weeks sapped away the money from the good weeks. So we were always, at the end of the year, we were always a few $1,000s in the hole. We could borrow. I was drawing a salary of $80, $90 a week and paid my expenses, you know, and I had a little cash in my pocket to go to restaurants and things like that. But I started Newport Jazz Festival in 1954 when Lorillards came into my club from Newport, Rhode Island. And they wanted to do something in Newport to make the summer a little more exciting. And Elaine Lorillard was the first one to come in. She brought her husband back a few nights later. And a professor from Boston University said to them, because Elaine was taking some classes at BU, and this professor was a jazz fan and a friend of mine, Donald Bourne. And he said, why don't you get George Wein to do something with jazz in Newport? And we didn't know what to do, you know. But I said, you know, there's a classical music festival in Tanglewood. Why can't we have our own jazz festival, you know? And would you back a 2-day event for jazz? And Louis said, sure. And he authorized his bank in Newport to give me a line of credit for $20,000, which was a fortune. I never saw that kind of money. And then they went to Capri, and I got together with my people, and I knew everybody in New England that came to my club. See, this was 1954. And I knew what artists would sell tickets that were then. And I put a program together for the first festival in '54. And the next thing you know, we'd made international news, and we were off to the races with the Newport Jazz Festival. And that, of course, established my international reputation, you know.
And what a run you've had. Unbelievable.
It's been an interesting run, and we're still running.
Yeah.
Our life is busier than ever. We're doing more festivals than ever. Just signed a new deal with Verizon to do 3 festivals. JVC is going to stay with us another few years. And we're doing festivals at Playboy in New Orleans and Mellon Bank in Pittsburgh. In Philadelphia, we do the Essence Music Festival for Essence Magazine. We do events for JVC and all over, I mean, 5 or 6 different JVC festivals. Newport Folk Festival we do still, and we're back in Newport after all these years. We do the big festival in New York. We do things at Saratoga, a big weekend at Saratoga. We're busy, and I've got a lot of wonderful people working for me that make it possible for me to do it. And
if I could ask you, mention a couple names, and maybe the first, just something that comes to mind about them. Joe Williams.
Joe Williams was a great singer. Everybody thought he was a blues singer. Well, put it this way, Joe Williams could sing the blues, but he was a great ballad singer. And that's, I think in his heart, he wanted to be a ballad singer. But he sang the blues as well as anybody. The big band jazz blues. He wasn't an old-time blues singer with a guitar walking the streets, you know, sort of like blind Lemon Jefferson, you know.
Yeah, right.
He was a jazz blues singer like Jimmy Rushing. Jimmy Rushing wasn't a blues singer. He sang the blues. Jimmy Rushing wanted to be a crooner. You know, all these people came out of their era.
Yeah.
Joe Williams wanted to be Frank Sinatra or Billy Eckstine, you know what I mean? but his life became a blues singer. Great artist, wonderful, wonderful man. And when he first came to Storyville with Count Basie and was singing every day, that's, you know, every day I have the blues, we knew something very exciting was happening. And he was around then as a star right till the end of the days. And he worked for me many, many times. I loved him dearly, you know.
Good statement. What about Basie? What did you learn from Basie? Is perhaps, I mean, the fact that he led his band for so many years, and
I learned a lot from Basie.
yeah,
I learned how to comp rhythmically. I learned how to lead a band without making a very ostentatious presentation. You didn't have to be a big shot up there waving your arms. I mean, I learned how to pace. He knew how to pace things. Above all, you just listen to him, you learn about swing. And a couple of people you learned, like Lionel Hampton and Basie, but they knew one thing, they knew how to swing. And also you learn about how to let your band stretch out without ever disrupting the structure of the number, but yet the musicians got a chance to play, and without taking over and playing too long or whatever it was. You learn how to program things. But I also learned what a great man Bill Basie was. I mean, again, I love these people. You can't know what they meant to me. And to be on the road. One time I was in, I'm telling you a couple of stories here that since there's the archive, I'm going to use these in my book. We were in Burma one night, and I had said to Lockjaw Davis, Eddie Davis, in Tokyo, you know, Basie doesn't play an encore. I says, well, you're the straw boss. Why don't you speak to him again? He says, well, you speak to Basie yourself. So the next day we were in Burma. We'd been sent there by the State Department. And I said, Bill, why don't you play an encore? He says to me, George, he says, I learned one thing in Birdland. Never give them too much. Leave them wanting more so they'll come back. I said, Bass, I says, I understand that completely. But when's the next time you're going to be in Burma? That night he played an encore. He played encores the rest of the tour. and he was supposed to fly to Laos the next day. Now, my father was with us. I brought him along on the tour. And he loved my father. He had tremendous respect for my father. And so his contract called for him to only fly scheduled airlines, no non-scheduled airline. But the date in Laos was an Army date, and they had Army planes, bucket seats. There was the Vietnam War was on, you know, and so they were flying to Laos the next day. And Bass says, I'm not going unless you go. I says, man, if you want me to go, I'll be there, because I hadn't intended to go. So it's 7 o'clock in the morning. I'm at the airport, and Basie's there. He says to me, what are you doing here? I said, you said you weren't going unless I went, so I'm going. He says, your father back at the hotel? I said, yes. He says, you get out of here and go back and take care of your father. And he went to Laos.
wow.
That's the kind of man Basie was. You know, so, you know, it's a beautiful story.
It's a lot, yeah.
Basie tells it differently in his book. He says, I wanted to go so I'd play piano with the band so he wouldn't go. I said, that's a nice story. That's a better story than mine, but that wasn't the story. He told the story in his book. He said, George wanted to go so he could play piano with the band.
Yeah, you stay home, Count. That's a good one. Wow. What about Coltrane?
John Coltrane was a giant, no question, he was a giant. And I have a few wonderful stories about Coltrane, but the saddest one was when I called him, I guess it was 6, 8 months before he died. And I wanted to do a European tour with him, because he did go to Europe for me a couple of times. He played my festivals many times. He played Storyville with Miles, and he played Japan for me. And I wasn't close to John Coltrane, but I knew him well enough, you know, so that I had tremendous respect for him. I guess he had a little respect for me. But I called him and I said, John, I'd like to talk to you about going to Europe. He said, well, I don't want to talk about anything now. He says, I'm not eating. I says, well, what kind of a regime are you on? What kind of diet you on? He says, I'm not on a diet, George. He says, I'm not eating. I said, John, you can't do that. You can't fast. I mean, you have to have something. Even when you fast, you have to feed yourself some nourishment. He says, no, I'm not doing anything because I want to clean out my system. I says, I didn't know what to say, you know. I said, John, you just can't do that, you know. So we hung up, and he was dead a few months later, you know. But he knew the sickness was inside of him, and he had a liver problem, you know, he had been so involved with drugs and alcohol in his early days, and it just got to him eventually. And he was a magnificent saxophone player, and when I heard him, and then I hear the people that copy him, it's two different worlds. He influenced too many saxophone players.
Too many.
Too many, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do you have an idea why, for that stretch of time, well, for too long, that the drugs were so much connected with jazz and so much a part of it?
I don't have any story about why it was. I don't know. And I'm not a sociologist in any way. I do know that prior to Charlie Parker, marijuana was because Louis Armstrong was a big influence in people smoking marijuana. Alcohol was a very big thing with musicians. A lot of musicians were heavy into alcohol. Pee Wee Russell, Vic Dickinson, or J.C. Higgins, all the guys with Basie's band, you know, Dickie Wells. They were real alcoholics. I mean, so there's something about the music business and the lack of stability in the life and in the road and everything that drives people into substitute drugs, substances, or anything that can give you a lift or take you out of the reality of the really not such a nice life you're living, because the only good life is when you're on the stand playing the music. Because the rest of the time you're living in those days you're living in two-bit hotels and eating junk for your dinner, and you had no money. Nobody made any money. The guys in Basie's band, Ellington's band, I don't care what nightclub players, they were playing 52nd Street for $40 a week, all this great legendary time. When you read about what a great place 52nd, it was great for everybody, you know, but the musicians were making nothing, and so they needed something. And when there were always people that led the way. Bird came along and he was into drugs. And Bird took over. I mean, Bird completely wiped out people's minds with the way he played. Nobody had ever heard that, and everybody wanted to play like that and be part of it. And I guess they thought they had to be on drugs to play like Bird. I mean, I don't want to say that was the case, because I've never studied it that much, but there's no question that drugs were rampant in the bebop era, and were not rampant before that. So that's all I can say.
Right. Okay. I brought a little piece of music to play for you. It might jog your memory. Goes back quite a ways.
It's Ruby Braff. Magic Horn, huh?
Yeah.
Am I playing piano there?
Yes, you are.
I must have been reading the music on something, because it doesn't sound like me. That's a funny story about that. We had this story, the Magic Horn was the story of a trumpet player. And I guess Sal Mineo was the young guy, and Ralph Mika was it. It was a television show. And I was the musical director for put the band together.
Yeah.
And God, I haven't heard that in ages. I wouldn't have guessed that for anything. I knew it was Ruby, because nobody plays like Ruby. And so the story was the trumpet player, Sal Mineo, was just an average trumpet player. And then when he got the magic horn, he became a great trumpet player. So I never made it out this way. I had Jimmy McPartland playing the trumpet for Sal Mineo before he got the magic horn, and Ruby Baff playing the trumpet for him after he got the magic horn. So I never told Jimmy, just loved being in the show. He didn't know what was going on. Jimmy McPartland was beautiful. Jimmy didn't have the greatest chops in the world, but he had a great musical head, and he could play wonderful music. But Ruby had chops as strong as, you know, as an elephant or a crocodile. He had chops. He could bite you like a crocodile, too. So, so Ruby became the magic horn.
That's funny.
And the television was Sal Mineo playing it. So, but that's nice to find that record.
Yeah.
You know, that's good.
That's part of our collection at the college.
That's good. You know, I had a lot of fun playing the piano. I played with great people. I played with Sidney Bechet, and I played in Brussels with him. I made 2 albums with Bechet. Played with Buck Clayton and Vic Dickinson and Doc Cheatham and Buddy Tate, and I did a week in Boston with Lester Young. Bird even came up and played with us one day in Storyville when we had a jam session in the afternoon. I mean, when I make a list, Buddy Rich and Jerry Mulligan, we recorded with them on Ruby and I, and at Newport, Bud Freeman, and all these great players. I mean, I played with them, and the fact that I did, and knowing that I wasn't in their league, but at the same time I didn't hurt them, and the records I made sound nice. I listened to them, I enjoyed them, because when there's a couple that are bad that I can't listen to, but most of them, because I'm my own severest critic, because I know how badly I can play, and I know when I don't play badly, you know, and because I know my own weaknesses, and so I'm very proud of the way the records I made, because the music on them is good.
Yeah. I'm glad you're still listening to them. I mean,
I do listen to them once in a while. I think a lot of them haven't been put out on CDs, and I might make a compilation of a lot of them and put out print up a few hundred CDs, send it to my friends they can use them for whatever, for ashtrays or whatever they want to use them for. But I am always impressed when there's a review. I've gotten some terrible reviews on playing the piano. I've had reviews with some saying those musicians wouldn't have played with George Weah unless he hired them. Well, that might have been true, but that doesn't mean that that's the reason they play with me. Because many times they would call me and say, hey, "Man, are you available for the gig?" You know, even though who's going to play piano? Are you going to play? You know what I mean? Because they wanted me to play. Because I never got in their way. They knew what they could count on from me. But other times, Dan Morgenstern's one of my big fans as a player. He's always written good things. But the English critics have always said nice things. George Weah played nice piano. Surprisingly, people didn't realize, surprisingly enough, George Weah played nice piano. That'll be on my tombstone, my epitaph, you know. I mean, we didn't know he could play like that, you know. So, every so often a musician comes up to me and says, "Man, I heard this record. And the piano, I didn't know what it was, and I found it was yours. Man, you were wailing." I mean, I love that.
Yeah.
I mean, man, that makes my day, you know. That makes my day when that happens, because a lot of people, you live with a lot of things when you're the producer, and I was, I've been, excuse the expression, I've been the man so long in producing festivals and everything. And, when I first used to sit down at the piano, they didn't think that I should sit down at the piano, a lot of critics. Who the hell was I to sit down at the piano? But man, I love to play the piano. And one time people said it's a bad use of power. But Peter Watrous wrote that once. And I called Peter, I says, "You don't know what the word power means." I said, "I have no power. I have a little privilege, because it is something, but power." I says, "Power is what's happening at Lincoln Center now, where they're spending $100 million just to build a theater for Wynton and the Lincoln Center Jazz. That's power. I mean, I'm out there scuffling to hire a musician to get him to work at a price that maybe we can make some money, and he can make some money, and I can break even at least, let my sponsor pay the money." You know, I mean, and every deal is a negotiation. Every single year we fight it out for them. We have no power, you know. And, I mean, I have the privilege of doing the business that I do, and I work very hard at it, and I enjoy it.
Yeah.
And I try to make as many friends as I can as I go along. And a lot of the older musicians, we had our problems over the years. They're all friends of mine now because I was always consistent. They were consistent. And if we couldn't get together at one time, 1 year, 3 or 4 years later, we got together, you know, and things changed, the relationship changed. And I don't care who it is. I don't think I have any enemies among the older musicians. Maybe the younger musicians were in the same position. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't even think I have many enemies among the younger musicians. At one time, I had a lot of people who resented the fact that I was the man at the Newport Jazz Festival. And they couldn't get on the festival unless I hired them. But I was still looking for the right people to have it. I wasn't.
Yeah.
It wasn't a matter of power. I hate that word.
Right.
I hate it like poison.
You've seen the business change an awful lot, and I think it's to your credit that you've found a way to negotiate, as you say, through the changes. And what do you think of it? What do you think of jazz, like this whole thing that goes on here? 15 years ago, I think it would have
What's
been.
happening here, and you're on the archives, but this is 2001 in January, and there are 7,000 people here for an IAJE Jazz Educators Convention. I've never seen anything like this in my life, because I don't think these people know much about jazz. They're jazz educators, but they don't have the knowledge that the people that used to come to the Newport Jazz Festival 30 years ago or 40 years ago did. Because there was a concern about every musician that was on the stage, who was playing bass, who was playing drums, you know, who was the new drummer with Basie, you know, I mean, everything. There was a concern. It was like if Ted Williams was traded for Joe DiMaggio, you know, for the Yankees to the Red Sox. It's like when Cootie left the Duke to go to Betty Goodman, they wrote a song about it when Cootie went. You know, that's the way jazz fans were in those days. I don't think people care like that anymore. They don't know that much. But there's some mystique about the word jazz that doesn't translate itself into record sales or ticket sales. And we have to compromise all the time on our festivals to draw people. By compromising, I mean we have to play good music with a certain degree of credibility, but maybe not the purity of jazz. Because I don't know for sure what the purity of jazz is now, because a lot of critics think that the purity of jazz has nothing to do with the jazz that I love. Ken Burns is being, you know, crucified because he's spending so much time with Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington and the swing era. Wynton is always being shot at. At the same time, they have everything going for them. They got all the money in the world. They got the subsidies, and you have the Ken Burns jazz. You know, and Ken Burns is the man in jazz. At the same time, the critics are killed. There's no in between. There's no saying, well, what Ken Burns did was good for everybody that's involved with jazz, because it is good for everybody that's involved with jazz. If you were a jazz musician and somebody says, "What do you do for a living?" and you say, "I play jazz," there's a little more respect for you because of the Ken Burns show. Oh, you play jazz. Well, I don't know much about jazz, but that must be an interesting life. I heard about this show. I saw this show on TV. The Lincoln Center Jazz Program is the most important institutional program for jazz in the world. That will spread to other cities. It already has. It will spread to other countries. And as it spreads, the different kinds of music will be involved. It won't just be what Wynton's idea of music is, because other musical directors will come involved. John Faddis at Carnegie Hall has a totally different concept of music from Wynton Marsalis. There will be people with the new jazz, with contemporary things, who will find their voice, who will find their place. And it really is only because, for the first time, major institutions are supporting and raising money for jazz. So you don't have to criticize what Wynton does. Wynton is doing his thing. Wynton Marsalis is a breath of fresh air in the jazz world. I love Wynton. I can criticize Wynton. That's unimportant. I don't criticize him. I don't criticize any musician, you know, because they're doing their thing. And man, one of these days, if their thing means something, it will pay off. I don't know whether they're going to make millions of dollars, but they will pay off in making a good living and being accepted as the artists they want to be accepted as.
Wow, it's a good statement. And I appreciate you making it. I'm gonna get you on your way here.
All right.
And I'm so appreciative.
You get me. I love to talk. You know, I like things like this because I can say whatever the hell I want to
Yeah,
say.
it's right.
I won't be on a panel. You'll never get me sitting on a panel. Because I don't like panels. I mean, I don't. You know, you want me to talk? If I can teach you something, or I can help you, or you can teach me something, great. Sitting on a panel. I was asked to be on a panel just recently, and it was an interesting panel. But I said I had made a pact myself. I nearly weakened, you know. And I had made a pact with myself, and I wrote them a very nice note. I said, I can't break the pact I made with myself. I won't sit on panels. Last year, I did something. I organized with Bob O'Meally of Columbia a symposium. And I said to Bob, I said, I don't want any of the older jazz critics in this symposium. I want a lot of the jazz educators, or the younger writers, the people that have been writing about jazz. We did it at Newport. Salve Regina College let us use the college. I called a bunch of different people, and a few foundations raised a little money. We needed about $50,000. I raised about 35. I put in the balance myself. And we had the most fascinating symposium because I paid all the speakers, I think $1,200, $1,500 or $1,000, I forget what it was. But they got a honorarium, but they had to write a paper, and they had to speak for an hour and a half, whatever time they wanted, you know. And we'd have subjects. Now, we might have 2 or 3 speakers on the same subject, but they'd have different approaches, but not a panel. Because I wanted something done on an intellectual level that didn't become self-serving, that they had done some, they weren't just complaining that their records weren't played on the radio, or that they went into record stores, they couldn't find their records, or that jazz is this or jazz is that. I wanted a point of view of people who were looking at this music, who had not lived this music. They were intellectuals. They were people with doctor's degrees, PhDs, who were now carrying the ball all over the country in universities. Many of these people are here right now. And it was fascinating. And we'll do that again. If we won't do it this year, we'll certainly do it next year. But it created a different kind of thing than the panels discussions, where you have 4 people, somebody talks for 5 minutes, and then somebody says something, somebody says, well, I don't agree with that. And I'm not interested whether you agree with it. Agree with it before or after the fact, and answer it in a paper. You know, that's fine. But just don't, you know, the panels, I've been involved with panels for nearly 45, 50 years, and they never say anything. Because it ends up being, well, no, that's not the way you know, everybody has a different, you know, and I was very proud of that symposium. We made a lot of friends. What Bob O'Meally is doing up at Columbia is very important in his jazz studies program. And a lot of the older critics were a little upset with me until I wrote them a letter, Dan Morgenstern, Ira Gidler, and wrote them a detailed letter about, you know, this is what you guys were fighting for all your life. A lot of them were African Americans. They were in universities teaching jazz. This is what you wanted. I says, they will never know the jazz that you know. You lived it. I said, but they're the ones that are going to be writing the books in the next 20 years. The history of jazz is in their hands. We have to reach these people. And so Dan Morgenstern came to the symposium as a guest. You know, he paid his own way to come. Because I invited them, but they had to pay their way. You know, because there were 80 people. We didn't charge a fee, but they had to pay their own transportation.
Right.
Dan came, and he was treated so beautifully by these people because he was like the senior citizen that really was the expert. And when they would keep calling, said, Dan, what do you think about? Dan, is this right? Dan left there on cloud 9,
I'm
you
so
know.
glad.
And he's one of the sweetest guys you'd ever want to meet, Dan Morgenstern, and one of the most knowledgeable guys. But I didn't ask him to do a paper. I wanted a different point of view. The next year, I may ask the older critics to do it. You see what I mean? Now that my point of view has come across, and they realize why I did. And I didn't make any enemies from it. You know, it looked like I was making enemies because they said, why aren't you using us? Why are you using those people? You know, they don't know anything about jazz. I said, I know they don't know anything about jazz. I said, but they're going to be writing the books. They better start learning. So,
Well, listen, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
well, it's
And,
4:45, 4:45, so
yeah, well,
that's
all
the
right.
time.
Okay,
I hope you got what you wanted.
I did.